Well, I'm here in Vancouver, British Columbia, very excited to be here. We are at the University of British Columbia, UBC, in the Green College, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm joined here by Karis Shearer. Hi, Karis.
Hi.
And Jenny Penberthy. Hi, Jenny.
Hello.
And since we're talking about where we are, I think it would be appropriate to do a land acknowledgement. Would you, Karis?
Yeah. I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, the traditional territory of those nations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have a Lorine Niedecker poem, or calendar entry, that Jenny has edited. This is a miraculous thing about this book, which you can see, a lovely book. There's also a paperback edition from California. And this must have been the first time these were published, the calendar entries?
Actually, they were published in Sulphur before.
Oh, okay, in
the magazine.
In a magazine.
Yeah.
But these calendar entries, and I guess I'll hold up, well, I should probably just find one in here. So Lorine wrote on her calendar, and we've picked out one for March, April 1935. And I'll ask Jenny to read it, and then we'll talk about it. Would you be willing?
Sure. March, April 1935. Her understanding of him is more touching than intelligent. He holds her knees without her knowing how she's boned.
It's extremely complicated, this little poem. Karis, touching is just a powerful pun. Lots going on with touching. Can you get us started on touching?
Yeah, I mean, the language of this poem is so sexual, isn't it? Touching as in
physical
affect
touch. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I guess I was
You were going the other way.
I was going to go the other way first. I mean, the idea of, something is touching, it's affective, it's full of feeling. And of course, the double play here is that it's also that physical, the physical touch.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So, Jenny, can you sort out the hims and hers here for us a little bit?
Well, I think the hims and hers are deliberately confusing, right? There's a great kind of tumble and wrestle of hims and hers going on here. One of the things about this page, this is a one of 27 pages in this tiny pocket calendar that she, where the calendar itself, the original calendar had its own text in this place, and she has pasted over a little sheet of paper, and on that has written her poem. So each of her poems pretty much erases a text beneath it.
A commercial text, something that was with the calendar.
Yeah, the sunlit road calendar, and the original texts were little kind of homilies, really, little instructions for how to lead a better life. So
there's an irony.
Yeah, really. As so often is the case with Niedecker, there's another text hovering behind what she herself has produced. So in a sense, her piece is a commentary, in a sense, on what came before. Absolutely. I think it's definitely a kind of riposte to the this sort of morality that's being peddled by this calendar.
What doesn't he know about her, Karis? I mean, there's a lot, but what do you get first?
I mean, that question of like how she's boned, right? I mean, I guess I read that. What does it mean to be boned? There's boning in skirts of a certain era, like it's boning a structure. So he doesn't He holds her knees without knowing how she's boned. He holds her knees, which are bones, right? Which are
the knees are bones. The skirt could be boned.
Yep. But without knowing how she's boned, how she's structured, right? And that's physical, but I think there's also a gesture here of how she's, just like touching has a physicality to it, but also an affective.
So it implies an attempt, male sexuality without knowledge of the body of the woman. Is that fair enough, Jenny?
Well, you know, I read this sentence really as a kind of jumble of language that's enacting the a kind of physical intimacy and you know, more particularly. It seems to me that it's enacting, you know, kind of sex.
Grammatically?
Well, partly, you know, partly. Okay, so I've got this kind of version of this in my head, which is this is sex on a single bed. You know, this little narrow piece of paper that she has at her disposal.
It is that awkward, isn't it?
None of the poem, none of the other 27 has as many hyphenated line endings.
Right.
You've got these jointed words.
She's really constrained.
It's very physical, the whole thing, and it's got that sort of, you know, which way upness, upside downness of sex. You know, it's like, you know, who's on top. You know, somebody's under. You know, these are knees, you know, where are the bones? They're too, it's like that sort of the clumsiness of sex, right?
Right.
You know?
It's as if they don't know each other physically.
Yeah.
The semicolon, so before the semicolon, it's what she understands of him, or the quality of her understanding, and after the semicolon, it's what he does or doesn't understand of her. So it's essentially a yin-yang thing. And so looking at the first one, we would say, in a simple paraphrase, the way she understands him is more about the emotions than the intelligence, or maybe is more sexual than intellectual. And afterwards, what he knows about her is that he wants to touch her, but he doesn't know anything about her body. Okay. So so if we say that the reference here is to Louis Zukofsky, it complicates things a lot, and there's no need to go into too much of that. But this is a real relationship that she's pondering here, presumably.
Yeah, and this was a poem. The entire calendar was a gift poem for him, right?
Did she give it to him?
She gave it to him, yeah. And, you know, it followed that period when they lived together in New York. It was very likely written in that period, 1934. One of the, you know, when Kenneth Cox saw this poem, he wrote back to me and said, "This is Niedecker's Sonnets of the Portuguese," which is kind of great. But also, you know, when I was thinking about this poem, I remember the comment that Allen Ginsberg made to me many years ago. He said, "Why is Niedecker so unsexy?" And he meant her poems, right? And I said, her poems are full of sex, just not in the way that your poems are full of sex.
That's a great rejoinder to Allen. What did he say?
Well, he said he'd have to take another look. But
it's an interesting thing to think about this poem as a gift to a lover, when this poem is basically saying, you know, okay, fucking is great, but you don't know anything about me.
Well, you know, the
Isn't
other
that an
thing.
Insult? He must have taken this not well.
I don't know. I mean, the other thing that one has to kind of consider here is, again, it's a little bit like the poem we just talked about. You know, how was this poem produced? Did she sit down and write it from scratch
on the
based
calendar.
based on a sexual encounter? This was the period when she was working with automatic writing, and she slept with a pencil under her pillow.
Wow, I didn't know that.
She was known. I mean, my current thing is to look at bio notes in journals and so on. I'm finding out so much about Niedecker just from these little biographies. Often just a line, but she has provided the bio note, right? So I learned just the other day that when she was published in the New Directions annual in 1937, her bio note has her down as Lorine Niedecker, who is known for her experiments with writing the unconscious. And yeah, for a stretch of about 6 years, she worked very concertedly on documenting the unconscious, right?
Do you think that the calendar poems do that to some degree?
I think the calendar poems quite likely are drawn from her notebook of automatic writings. But then, it's a little bit like the Linnaeus poem where, okay, you start with a text that you have arrived at by some means or other, and then you modify slightly, because I think there are interventions here that are being made for sound, but the basic text, I would guess, arose out of this documenting of the unconscious.
Well, that's really good, because it cues us as to how to read it. It's so jumbled that one doesn't want to really parse it out, or you'll break the idea. So I'll read it again, and I'll ask the two of you to imagine it as something of a dream work, something that doesn't have to that follows a little more automatically the way logic might work. And then I'll ask what each of you think, and then we'll have some final words about this little poem. Okay, so I'm reading it, and you're thinking of it as a automatic / dreamy thing. Her understanding of him is more touching than intelligent. He holds her knees without her knowing how she's boned. Karis, did that help?
Yeah, I mean, I want to come back to that word that you started us with, which is touching, right? Like, this poem invites us to kind of go to that gendered, well, she's more feeling and he's more,
right.
Well, he's not more physical. He's physical, but he doesn't understand the body. But if we read that doubleness of touching, right, it's not just about feeling.
Yeah.
If touching is both affective and the physical touch, right? That in fact she has the upper hand and a more sense of the body and of the feeling.
Jenny, your thought on reading it that way?
Well, I do. I like what Karis says there, and it's interesting that in the script that she wrote a year later, or published a year later anyway, Domestic and Unavoidable, there's a similar reversal there of the kind of gender expectations, where she has this great line where the women, and I forget how, I can't quote it exactly, but it's the women, after dinner, the women smoked and the men retired to the front room.
Right.
This kind of great reversal.
There is a little bit of that here, isn't there?
Yeah.
That's really cool. Let's get final thoughts, one each on this. Karis, are you ready with a final thought?
Yeah, I mean, the calendar poems are fairly new to me, and
you like them?
I love this one.
Yeah, why?
I think one of the things that I would love to do at some point is talk about this as a visual poem. You know, we've talked a little bit about the line breaks and the constraint of the space, but I want to think a little bit about how, as a visual poem, we have almost that single bed that you mentioned, right? That the poem is chopped up by the space, but it's also a poem that is on a calendar that has that references the daily with all of the 2 weeks, and it's March April, right? It's a kind of verdant poem of
life and growth and emergence and sex, procreation, spring.
But we're not sure about the procreation, right? Because things aren't quite working.
Not
here.
these
And
two.
so-
Yeah, not these two.
So there's a kind of a tension
we
between.
don't want to go there.
No, we don't. Jenny.
I think it's a great visual poem.
It's a visual poem, and I think
yeah.
we the conversation hasn't yet emphasized that quite enough. So it's really important for people who are watching this conversation to think of this as a calendar entry, right? Instead of saying, I need to, get the milk, and this was the day my great aunt's birthday.
It's a calendar poem, and it's handwritten too, and I think we didn't talk a lot about the handwriting, but the fact that it's not typed and that it is, that it's, that it's handwritten and marked by her particular.
Yes, handwritten as a gift to somebody. Yeah.
I'll do my final word, and then Jenny will have hers. Well, maybe I have two, but they're quick. One is the word boned. I mean, any young person today reading this will think of boned as sex, intercourse, penetration. Now, and it wouldn't have been that is today's language. It wouldn't have been far-fetched for her to think of that pun also. But a little more interestingly, I just want to commend the thing that Jenny said earlier, that Karis just referred to, which is the extraordinary way in which this is a poem like every poem, where the form of the poem is itself its content. This is what you were saying about the jumble or the single bed, right? The reason the three of us like poetry is that poetry, unlike most prose, must be conscious of the lineation, and the lineation must be conscious of things like the writing surface or the typing surface. And that's what this poem is. It is absolutely a poem, not simply a calendar entry, because it functions like any poem formally. Yeah. Jenny, final thought.
So maybe I'll go back to mentioning Emily Dickinson here, because Dickinson...
Envelope poems?
Oh,
Scrap of paper
lovely,
poems?
lovely. Yeah, I wasn't thinking of that. But, Dickinson was very much an important writer for Niedecker in this period, interestingly, at the same time that she was doing all this kind of study of the mind and the unconscious and different levels of consciousness. But one of the things that strikes me about this, and also all the other of these calendar pages, is the poem has a slightly epigrammatic quality. And,
it sure does.
And that's so true of a lot of Dickinson's writing as well. And often that those poems of Dickinson's are kind of baffling. There'll be a few stanzas that one just simply can't wrap one's head around.
Right.
And she's arrived at those, of course, by an entirely different process. But there is that similar kind of unfathomable, inscrutable quality to these poems of Niedecker's, these calendar poems. One final thought, if I may. I was reminded, reading this poem, is particularly here where she says, "He holds her knees." of a later poem in the 60s, which is Watching Dancers on Skates. And the title of that poem is Watching DAN hyphen, and then next line, Sirs on Skates. And of course she's echoing the position of these skaters. But let me quickly read it since it's such a tiny poem. Watching dancers on skates, 10,000 women and I the only one in boots. Life's dance, they meet, he holds her leg up. And it's almost as though there was a kind of residual memory of this earlier calendar poem there.
Those two sound more in sync, though, the skaters. It's a pair of skaters.
They are, yes, but it is also there's a slightly different gender awareness in the 60s poem. It's sadder, a sadder one.
Right.
This one, there's much more agency in the earlier poem.
One gets the sense that there is at least a pair in the skating poem. And
yeah,
here,
true.
this is not a pair, it's just two people jumbling over each other.
You know, but I think it's also funny, you know, again, it's Niedecker being funny about this basic fact that physical intimacy is often a cumbersome business. You know, it's not a gorgeous lyrical thing necessarily, right?
She's certainly saying that.
Yeah.
Karis, thank you so much. Jenny, this has been great. Thank you both.
Thanks, Al.
Thanks. Yeah.